Okay, hello everybody. This is Deb, and today's webinar, as you can see, is going to deal with rubrics and scoring guides. This is a webinar for EPPs who will host their visits when the CAPE standards are required. So that's fall 2016 visits or later. And I want to make that clear because occasionally we've had folks who are considered early adopters on the webinars. And early adopters are those who are coming up for their CAPE visits before fall 2016. So that's before the CAPE standards are recommended. And in those cases, there are some special guidelines or questions that are applicable only to early adopters. And so today we're not talking about that. Only talking for those folks who are hosting visits in fall 2016 or later when CAPE standards are required. And today we'll be speaking exclusively about rubrics and scoring guides. All right. Our next, there we go. Please mute your phone. If you haven't done that already, I see many of you that are online have muted your telephones, and for that I thank you. Occasionally we get feedback, barking dogs or people who are coming in and asking you questions, whether that's at home or in your offices. And so to keep us from hearing your private conversations, mute your phones. The trick, however, is to remember to unmute yourself when you want to talk. I always tell the story about being on a webinar and asking a question and realizing that everything was going on without me and I had forgotten to unmute myself. So definitely do that. There are two ways to ask a question during the presentation. You can use the chat room, as two people just did, to let me know that they were able to hear me. And to do that, at the top of your screen, there should be a little green bar that you can click on or hover over, and a number of options will come up at the top of your screen. If you click on participants, you'll be able to see who else is present. And if you click on chat, a little box will open up where you can type a question into the box and select who you want to send that question to. You can send it to all participants, or you can select another participant, or you can select CAPE Staff 1, which is me. And I welcome you to do that. And I will pause occasionally during the presentation to ask if there are any questions. The other thing you can do is to raise your hand. That is a feature that you have when your participant box is open, and you should be able to click on that hand to let me know that you have a question. And occasionally I will pause to view all participants and see if there's anyone with a hand raised, and I will call on you. I have had a little bit of an issue in the past seeing all the questions in the chat room. And if it happens that you type in a question and I don't address it, please raise your hand or please just talk during the presentation and ask the question live. Okay, there are CAPE staff members, hopefully, who will be online. And I'd ask them to feel free to interject as they need and as they have clarifications or additional information to provide. So they may do that. Also, this webinar is being recorded, and it's usually available the day after, but I generally promise it within a week after the webinar, and it's available on the CAPE website under Resources. So without further ado, we're going to move forward and go to our next slide. Our goal today is really to problematize this quality of rubrics and scoring guides and to strategize their use in the self-study. As you know, one of CAPE's priorities is the quality of the evidence that EPPs provide to the accreditor to demonstrate that they're meeting the standards or are proving their claims if they're in the inquiry brief pathway. And so part of CAPE's priority now is to look at the quality of the evidence that's being provided. And today we'll look at the quality or not quality of rubrics and scoring guides. And I have a couple of samples to share with you as we go through the criteria that CAPE will use to judge the quality of those items, of those pieces of evidence. I've switched from talking about an agenda to talking about what my objectives are. This is in response to some feedback from the last few webinars. What I hope you'll be able to do, although I'm very positive here, saying participants will be able to, Articulate the pros and cons of rubrics and scoring guides, and that's the first slide that we'll talk about. That you will be able to develop responses to evidence quality questions related to your scoring guide and your rubric, and that you'll be able to apply the criteria for evidence review to a sample rubric and scoring guide, and then hopefully independently on your own rubrics and scoring guides. So let's move right along. The positive and negative aspects of rubrics and scoring guides. There are three major buckets that we can talk about in terms of what are the pros of rubrics and scoring guides. And one of the positive aspects is the ability to identify categories of performance. You know, for CAPE and meeting standard 1.1, there are at least 4 categories of performance that you're being directed to align with your rubrics and scoring guides, and those are the 4 in-task categories. Not all of the in-task standards, but those 4 categories of performance. And so what scoring guides and rubrics help us to do are to identify what are the categories of performance that are being evaluated. Another positive aspect of rubrics and scoring guides is that many are EPP created and very specific to the mission of an EPP. We used to talk about conceptual frameworks, and this is the way that the rubrics and the scoring guides can align with your conceptual framework by highlighting those aspects of candidate performance that you consider to be the most imperative in your particular EPP. So for example, as I was working with a number of institutions in the New York City area, a good strong aspect of rubrics or scoring guides or observational materials that we developed had to do with teaching in an urban context and sensitivity to diversity and differentiated learning instruction, et cetera. And so that's something that an EPP can build in, of course, into your rubrics and scoring guides that very much hold the candidates responsible for developing those skills and dispositions and the content knowledge that you consider important. And another positive, which can be a negative, and that's where we'll flip over to the con side, is that there is the appearance of shared understanding. If it's a rubric or a scoring guide that's used across multiple programs or there are similar categories of performance, then it does imply that there's a shared understanding. And that's a good thing, so that everybody's on the same page. Let's go over to the con side, which I more or less tried to align with each of these positive aspects to talk about what some of the not so positive aspects of rubrics and scoring guides can be. First, in identifying the categories of performance, is that there's often in the scoring guides that CAPE has received a lack of explicit definition of expectations among levels of performance. And we'll be looking at some examples later on in the webinar to show you a way in which a rubric can be a rubric and yet not provide the level of explicit definitions of those expectations, so they become sort of vague. And an example that I put up here is the never, often, always. We don't know what often means. Certainly you can say never and always, but what's often? 3 times, 5 times? And CAPE even has some criteria about using what's what I'm looking for? The numbers of times that something occurs. There's both positive and negative aspects of that, and we'll get into that in a minute. Also, we found with these categories of performance that with a rather vague definition of expectations also comes a limited opportunity for providing feedback to candidates. So although categories of performance are identified, talking about what each level would mean for a particular category of performance or item on a rubric or scoring guide, that the level of specificity should be such that you could provide high quality feedback to candidates, or candidates when looking at a rubric or a scoring guide would know what they needed to do in order to achieve at a particular level. Okay, the next area that that's a positive is that it's EPP created and specific to the mission. But on the negative side to that is that there may not be a comprehensive alignment with standards. And if you've had an opportunity to look deeply at the CAPE Accreditation Handbook or the CAPE Evidence Guide, you'll see that the relevance of an instrument, the appropriateness of an instrument is particularly geared to the alignment with CAPE standards and in-task categories of performance, as well as your state standards and any other standards that you choose to use, such as college and career ready standards or next generation science standards. So that alignment with standards is pretty important. And with some EPP created instruments that may not be, or scoring guides and rubrics that may not be particularly evident. And so there may be missing key elements of knowledge, skills, and dispositions that are required by standards. And so a really, one thing we'll talk about in a minute is that alignment to standards and how to ensure that those key areas of knowledge, skills, and dispositions that the standards are talking about will be included in your rubrics and your scoring guides. And so this appearance of shared understanding is the last pro that we'll take a look at what are the negative aspects of that. And I think the important wording here is the appearance of shared understanding, because there may not be sort of inter-rater reliability. And I don't know how many EPPs out there have taken the opportunity to sit down and train their raters. Faculty members may assume that they all mean the same thing by a particular behavior, let's say. And I'm reminded of a while back at Hunter College when they began to videotape student teachers. And as an exercise, they shared video clips at a faculty meeting and had the faculty members independently rate what they were seeing in the video clip and write down sort of the key elements of what they saw. And there was a wide range of responses. Not everybody, even though they were teaching in the same college and had the same conceptual framework and mission and taught in the same department and conversed regularly as colleagues, when they really got down to looking at candidate performance, there wasn't the shared understanding that they had all believed was apparent and really didn't need much investigation. And so that really opened up an opportunity for the college to deepen their understanding of what they meant by certain skills and what it meant to be looking at a very effective performance of a particular skill, and something that's not quite there but getting there, and something that's clearly not appropriate. Okay. And then whether or not the rubric or the scoring guide is actually measuring what is intended to measure can also be overlooked. And we'll be talking much more about that in just a moment. So any questions or comments at this point? What I'm going to do is drag over my participant. And I see someone with their hand up. I'm so excited. Kathleen, you have a question. So unmute yourself and please ask away. Kathleen, I know you're there. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to unmute you myself. There we go.
Hello. Okay.
There you are.
My understanding was that the in-task standards are specific for the initial programs.
Yes, but CAPE is saying you do not need to meet all 10 in-task standards. You do need to align with the 4 categories of in-task.
Right, but those 4 categories now, we're going to be looking at those 4 categories for all of our programs, is that correct?
Well, for your initial programs, definitely, yes.
Well, I know for initial, but when we're looking at rubrics, will they also apply to advanced and other?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question, and you'll have to give me some time to go back and look at the advanced standards to see what the wording on those is exactly under 1.1.
Okay, thank you.
Recall, I think it's similar because INTAS does have the progression levels that start with sort of what a beginning teacher should be able to know and not able to do, and then goes to the more advanced levels through that progression. And so it may well be that the advanced standards, at least for the teaching portion, would apply.
And those 4 progressions are the ones that appear on page 18 in the in-task manual?
Yes.
Okay. All right,
yes.
Thanks.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for your question. And I'm going to put you back on mute, and we're going to go on to our next slide. Yes, we are. My screen has frozen, so let me do it this way. Okay. Here are some of the quality questions that Kate has developed in terms of looking at your instruments, your rubrics, and your scoring guides. And the first one, as I mentioned earlier, is in terms of its appropriateness. Is there an alignment with standards? And we've talked about all the standards that one might align with. CAPE standards, in-task categories, your state standards, and others. Okay? A next quality check question is whether or not the items are definable. Is there an agreed upon meaning? And that is something that you would want to discuss with your faculty, and definitely with those who are using the instrument, using the scoring guide or the rubric for evaluating candidates. And we'll look at a couple, again, a couple of examples in a minute where we can delve into this idea of definable a little deeper. Next, we're looking at observability. Is the rubric and scoring guide explicit in defining the expectations at distinct levels of performance? Again, we'll go back to a couple of examples and use this exact quality check questions and apply those to a couple of different rubrics and scoring guides. And are they distinct enough from one another that they provide specific and meaningful feedback? Then are they complete in the sense that all the various criteria come together to describe the whole of the learning outcome? And of course, other would be this freedom from bias. Is inter-rater reliability, has it been established? And does the instrument measure what it purports to measure? So these are some quality check questions that as you look at your own rubrics, look at submitting your rubrics and scoring guides to CAPE, either during the early instrument evaluation, ahead of your self-study to get some feedback from CAPE on your instruments, or as you're submitting your self-study. These would be questions that you'll want to be explicit in answering so that your reviewers will have the background on them and be able to better evaluate them. And we will be looking at the assessment rubric that CAPE will be using to evaluate your instruments. So here's an example. Let's start with this one little example of an observational item. And it was whether or not the candidate demonstrates an in-depth knowledge of differentiated instructional strategies. Okay? Now, this appears in 2 ways. One, it was on a self-assessment rating that went from 1 to 5, and the candidate self-assessed whether they felt they demonstrated in-depth knowledge of differentiated instructional strategies, and all that the rubric provided there was really a rating scale. All it provided was very low to very high, and there was no definition of what that meant at all. And yet, there was a rubric provided for supervisors to rate candidates on whether they diversified teaching and learning approaches, okay, which would relate to this differentiating instructional strategies. And here, you can see there were just 3 possible ratings. 1, needs improvement. 2, average. 3, target. Okay? And in this particular rubric, you can see that needs improvement, the teacher diversifies, okay, but doesn't motivate students and doesn't direct students towards self-learning. So there are really 3 parts to what is considered diversifying teaching and learning approaches: diversification, motivation, and directing towards self-learning. In the average rating, the teacher diversifies and motivates, but doesn't direct towards self-learning. And in the third, diversifies, motivates, and directs them to self-learning. So at this point, I'd like to open it up for a little bit of feedback from others. I've done this in the past and not gotten much of a response, but I'm always willing to try again. Anybody with a comment here? Maybe I should just unmute you all for a second. Anybody? Okay, so let's go back to the previous slide that we talked about in terms of quality checking. So, appropriate, is it aligned with standards? And the answer to that would be definitely not, or at least we don't see that anywhere on the rubric that the standards are identified. Okay? So was the differentiating instruction, would that fall under the in-task category of the learner and learning? Or would it fall under the in-task category of instructional practices or content? Because one part talked about in-depth content, in-depth knowledge. Okay, so there's some work that could be done on this particular rubric or scoring guide in terms of alignment with standards. Is there agreed upon meaning? And this I don't think we're sure about. If we look at, let me go next and next. If we look at diversifying teaching and learning approaches, in all three cases, the teacher can diversify teaching and learning methods and approaches. So I'm kind of curious about what that would mean. It doesn't seem that there's any room here for somebody who doesn't diversify instruction. What would it look like if someone didn't? And then what would you do if you didn't see diversifying instruction? Okay, let's go back to the earlier one and look at the next one. Is it observable in defining expectations, and are the expectations distinct from one another? Would they provide meaningful feedback? Well, if we look at this, I keep going back too far. Apologize for this, I'm just clicking on the wrong buttons. Okay, if it's distinct from one another, if these are observable, okay, and I guess you could observe whether or not someone's motivating, whether or not they're directing students towards self-learning, and whether or not they're diversifying, but there does seem to be a lack of explicitness here about what that means. I do see a question in the chat now, and I'm going to turn to that question. It says, how do we provide sufficient specificity to rubrics that cover a myriad of standards without having a rubric with an overwhelming number of criteria? Hey, that's a really good question, and we'll look at some rubrics in a minute that are able to do that. You can include in one category, as this one does, a number of different items that contribute to that particular category of performance. So diversifying teaching and learning approaches, as I said, there is, diversifies, motivates, directs student towards self-learning. So we can assume that those are three aspects of diversifying instruction within one rubric that, within one item of rubric, okay, one rubric item, that kind of consolidates a number of features into one. Stevie Chepko has pointed out in the past that you can also use bullets of, this, and this are the behaviors expected under this category of performance. So let me show you a couple of other examples of rubrics, and perhaps this will help to answer the question a little bit more. But this is something that all of us have struggled with. You get a rubric that's pages and pages and pages and pages long. It's a little daunting. And at the same time, I think we need to be able to make some judgments for ourselves about the alignment of those standards, where you're not designing rubrics that in Section 1 speak to INTAS standards, and Section 2, and I know you know this, Section 2 talking to state standards, but trying to create an alignment amongst all those standards, and therefore not having to put in 4 separate items for one particular thing that is really related. But perhaps those bullets, as Stevie suggested, could help solve the problem. Now let me get to, right there, next slide. Oops. Okay, so as you know, on the CAPE website, under resources, you can find the CAPE assessment rubric for evaluation of rubrics and scoring guides. And what we'll be talking about today are categories 1, 2, 3, 6, and 7 of that scoring guide. And what I want to point out to you, and I have a number of documents, oops, over here in the corner. Let me go back to previous and end slideshow here for just a minute. Okay, and diminish it so that I can share some other good things with you. Okay, so the CAPE evidence guide. I want to point this out first, because then we're going to go back to that rubric. This is the CAPE evidence guide on pages 23. It starts on page 23, and these are the actual questions that will be used by the reviewers about your rubrics and scoring guides. How are the assessments used? How are the instruments created? How are they scored? Et cetera, et cetera. And these are the same categories of performance that you find on the CAPE evidence guide, on the CAPE assessment rubric. Okay, so let me go to our assessment rubric and take a peek at that. So there it is. What's the purpose of this instrument and how is it used? Okay, that's the first category. And as you'll see here, there are 4 levels of performance and a space for reviewer comments. The 4 levels of performance are recommended by some assessment people because it forces from going straight to the middle. In a 5-point rubric, often people will tend toward the middle, the same with a 3-point rubric, and so a 4-point rubric kind of makes people look a little closer at this is a 2, a 3, or a 4, all right? Instrument purpose and use, and that was one of the first questions out of that evidence guide, and so this assessment rubric is responding directly and aligned with the evidence guide. Instrument development, and then one of the 5th categories of questions on the evidence guide is information for respondents and whether that's been given. And if you look at this particular rubric, you see where the bullet points, this is an example of how the bullet points are used to put a number of discrete items within this larger category of performance, how it can be included in the rubric. So under purpose and use, not meeting the CAPE criteria would mean that the use of the instrument during preparation is just generally described or ambiguous, okay, that its purpose and use in candidate monitoring on progression are just generally described and specific standards are addressed by the instrument, so there is no alignment being shown. And so if we were to look at the very first rubric I showed you in the PowerPoint, it would not meet. It would probably be the level 1 in terms of describing where it is during preparation, although we do not see the responses to those questions. I'm making a huge assumption for us. Okay, so here on the second level, it's saying the use of the instrument is generally described, but not in terms of the sequence of candidate progression. Okay, the pointer, and if we go on to level 3, the pointer points where the instrument is administered during the program are very explicit. The purpose and use on progression are specified, and then it goes on to the highest level here where the point where the instrument is administered is explicit. So one of the things that you'll want to do as you're preparing your self-study is definitely go to these assessment rubrics and look at the level 3, the level 4, which meet okay, the minimum criteria, or demonstrates target criteria, to know that this is where you should be in answering the questions that CAPE will pose about your instruments. So I want to share with you right now an instrument I got off the web that is a scoring rubric, okay, for a teacher ed portfolio. And this one, I do not know what institution this is from. I do know it's from, it's in Oklahoma because it says that later on, but I do not know what particular institution or EPP is using this. And even if it's current or not, I have no idea, okay? What's interesting about this is that it is clear that this is a scoring rubric, okay, for a portfolio. And yet what we have here are 1 point or 2 or no points, and that it's going through basic a checklist of parts, okay? Does it have this, does it have that, does it have this, does it have that? Okay, fine. At least we can say for this, that if this is being used as sort of a culminating portfolio for students, there isn't any real performance base here, and it's basically a checklist. And so if we go to CAPE's criteria, quality check questions would have to say that in many aspects, this particular part 1, part 2 of the portfolio rubric would not meet any at this point of CAPE's criteria. So let's go on. The next part of the portfolio has competency areas. And as you can see, they're basically stated as categories, okay, core curriculum, but I don't know what that means, what the competency is related to core curriculum. And what it asks for is whether or not there is an artifact associated with each one of these, okay? Then we get down to the actual rubric. And as you can see here, that there are 2 aspects by which each of the portfolio entries would be scored. One is in terms of reflection, and the other is the artifact, okay? A target is that reflection has 5 pieces. There's a description of it, there's a defense of it, and that it relates to what they call the lighthouse metaphor. An acceptable one also has 5 portions of reflection included, okay? But there's not a strong relationship between the artifact and the competency, and there's a weak relationship of the artifact to the metaphor. And in all of this, if we go back to those CAPE criteria, is it appropriate? We don't see here alignment to standards. We're not seeing distinct levels of performance per se. We're not seeing whether these categories of competency that were outlined here, if they are defined or observable, for that matter. We don't know. And this section, this entire section, was labeled completed by the supervisor upon completion of student teaching, okay? So there is something that one might assume would have to do with explicit observable performances related to these competencies, but we don't know that. Okay, so let me go back now into my shared screen, okay, and see if I have any other questions. Yes, there was a question about where is the rubric found. The assessment rubric, the CAPE assessment rubric, is found on the CAPE website at www.capenet.org/resources. And when you click on resources, there's a pull-down menu that comes up. Don't select any of the sidebar items on the pull-down menu. Just simply click on the resources tab at the top of the screen, and the assessment rubric should be there. There's another possibility. Well, let's see. I could show you That's where you find it. You find it under Resources. You can also, in the pull-down menu, there is a section that says CAPE accreditation documents, and you can click on that, and I believe the assessment rubric is also there. Also, if you have access to AIMS, the handbook, the evidence guide, and the assessment rubric are also available, I believe, under Resources and AIMS. So I hope that's helpful. All right, let me go in and see if we have anybody else with their hands up. I need to enlarge this a little bit because I can't click on the view all attendees. Let's see. Okay, Greg, I see your hand up. I'm going to unmute you. There we go. Greg, you have a question?
Yeah, I want to go back to the initial question that was asked about lengthy rubrics. Our state teaching standards are, I mean, it's unbelievable the number of knowledge and performance indicators that are listed in there for all 9 of the standards. I mean, at some point, we're going to have to find some way to manage these in a way that mentor teachers will accept. Right now, we tried to create the detailed rubric that you're asking for.
The CAPE is asking for. Yeah.
And the CAPE is asking for, and our student teaching placement coordinator said that our mentor teachers just will not fill this out.
Right. Yes, I've heard of
because it takes so much of their time.
So your question is how to consolidate that?
What we ended up going to is I think we ended up going to, it might not even be a 1 to 4, it might be a 1 to 3 rating scale, but then each of the ratings is described what you would accept as acceptable and then target.
Yeah, what I know a number of places have done is, well, we had a big discussion about this actually at the CAPE conference. There were a lot of early adopters, or a number of early adopters at that meeting, and we had a good long discussion about this because they found that for their rubric, what they were going to move towards in the coming year was to put what they expected their beginning teachers to be able to do when they left their program as the highest level of performance, rather than even having target what sort of went above and beyond what their expectation would be, because they were having difficulty with cooperating teachers rating the student teachers very high, consistently, despite training, despite, having conversations about that. And they found that what was happening is that, they all felt, liked their student teacher and wanted their student teacher to get an A in the course, and felt in order for them to do that, they had to rate them at the highest level. Well, we know that, many of our student teachers or clinical residents are not going to be at the target level of performance. One of the things that you might consider doing is, as you reduce the number of levels so that there's fewer of those, you're also sacrificing some of those explicit distinctions level to level. But if your highest level is really this is where we want you to be when you leave us, and leave room for reviewer comments so that somebody could put in when they feel that their student teacher or clinical resident has exceeded that may be a possibility or something that you could discuss. The other thing is that, I know that often standards have so many, subcategories that you've got over, 90 or 100 discrete items, and that's not going to be wholly possible for us as EPPs, as faculty members, as clinical supervisors, to be able to look for each and every one of those. And so we've got to go with these broader categories of performance and go for incorporating a number of those discrete elements into a larger category of performance. And I guess, Greg, that's my best suggestion at this point, without seeing your rubric and, sitting down with you and having a longer discussion. So go ahead.
So for instance, under professionalism, I don't know at the moment, I don't know the exact number of knowledge and performance indicators there are, but there could easily be 8 or 9 of them for that one standard. To try to create the detailed rubric that you're talking about for each one of those indicators makes that one piece of the entire rubric a chore for a mentor teacher.
Sure. Yeah.
Especially if there's 9 standards. So, I mean, we need some guidance from CAPE on how to work with these standards in a manageable way.
Okay. I can appreciate that, and I will certainly suggest that one of the things that Kate and I want to consider is a workshop for something like that gets into very specific, okay, bring your rubrics and let's look at those very closely and see how we can work with each other. I'm sure there are many, many, many EPPs out there struggling with the same sorts of issues, and that might be a very valuable workshop idea, is to dig into these individual instruments, particularly after CAPE has had a chance to review some instruments as part of their early instrument evaluation, and perhaps come out with some examples of what people have done. I think that'll also be helpful, and I'll pass that along. I think that's the best I can do right now. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that works.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yep. Okay, so we were looking at the assessment rubric in terms of the purpose and use, and how you can use this instrument in these first 3 categories, category 1, 2, and 3, which relate to the evidence guide, is to help formulate the narrative that would accompany your self-study when you submit your assessment instruments, scoring guides, and rubrics to CAPE as part of your self-study. So this next one talks about how the instrument was developed, and I'm not going to sit here and read through the rubric for you on that particular aspect, but just know in general terms that the purpose and use, the development, and how information is provided to respondents is something you'll have to answer about any instrument that you submit as part of your self-study, whether it's a scoring guide or a rubric or whatever. So if we move down, however, to categories 6 and 7, okay, category 4 is about assessments and assignments. Category 5 is about observation protocols. And here we go, under C, rubrics for scoring guides, okay? So the first thing it talks about are these scoring levels, whether those proficiency levels are clearly distinguishable, okay? And it talks about the use of rating scales, okay, in lieu of rubrics. And if you remember earlier PowerPoint slide that showed from very low to very high, there's your rating scale, which is not an effective, would not meet CAPE's minimum criteria. And it talks about vague and general terms used to differentiate levels. And I think we saw an example of that in as well when it talked about, well, a candidate diversifies instruction at this level but does not motivate. And that in itself can be, although it does give us the elements that the EPP is looking for within the general topic of differentiating and diversifying teaching and learning, it doesn't give a lot of specificity to the candidates. so that the key attributes of what it means to be diversifying instruction at an acceptable level and motivating students and directing them to self-learning, it doesn't really tell us what that would mean or what that performance would look like if we were to observe it. Okay. I'll allow you to go through this in your time. Okay. There is another section of this scoring guide for rubrics is the training of the scorers themselves. And one of the things you will want to think about is that there are multiple raters, not just one person rating a candidate in a particular item, and that these scorers are trained. Okay? And that in the highest category performance, that the results of the candidate evaluation scorings are monitored over time and they're compared, okay, so that you can see how things are evolving. And then it talks about scoring attributes as well. And again, you can use these rubrics as a way to evaluate your own rubrics and scoring guides in thinking about how might we improve. And a good way to do that might also be to share it with someone who's not necessarily a part of your EPP to see if there is a shared or common understanding, or if some of your terms might be vague that you think are not, or to do what I mentioned earlier that a university did by sharing a particular snippet from a candidate teaching a lesson and seeing if there is agreement about what everyone is looking at. And I think one of the strong points of this rubric that hasn't been a point of evaluation in the past is whether or not feedback is being provided to the candidates in a responsible way. And these rubrics really give us an idea of what Kate means by that, which is that the feedback is actionable, that a candidate could look at a rubric and say, oh, here's what I need to be able to do to reach this level of performance, and that a scorer can look at the rubric and say, oh, you know, gee, that was a great lesson and the kids were very engaged and motivated. However, you know, these are the aspects of that performance that we're missing or need improvement. Perhaps it's questioning, perhaps it's this or that, but the rubric would give your scorers a way into a conversation about two candidates about how to improve their performance. Okay? All right. So those are the categories. The next part of this assessment rubric deals with surveys, and we will be talking about surveys in a future webinar. So let me share another couple of items with you. I want to share another scoring guide that I found on the web. This is from the University of New Haven, and I've chosen to share it because it has, in many ways, some of the aspects that we would be looking for in a scoring guide, and one of them has to do with this alignment. You can see here that it's aligning with what the university considers its important competencies, and it also has what the state of Connecticut has as its state standards. And you can see how they're also grouping certain standards, certain state standards together, okay? So that it's not only meeting, let me see if I can scroll down here. Yeah, there we go. Where it's not only meeting 4.1 of the Connecticut standards, it's also meeting 4.3. And you'll notice how they, too, are using this bulleted approach to describe levels of performance. And they, too, have a 3-point rubric, okay? That the sequence of lessons, for example, is illogical, that it is somewhat logical, but connections are unclear or not explicit, and it clearly an explicit focus on conceptual. I'm reading across here on designing of logical and coherent instruction. I do see another question here, so let me just finish with this particular rubric, and then I'll get to some of our other questions. Okay, so this one here has aspects of that are quality check, the quality check questions again, would seem to be appropriate and that it is aligned with standards that are important to the unit, and it would be a simple matter really to insert the CAPE standards there, the in-task categories. It does identify the competency, which the first rubric, as you remember, that was a portfolio rubric, did not. It simply said core curriculum, but we didn't know what it meant in core curriculum. And its levels of performance do move in a progression, okay, from what would be unacceptable to what would be acceptable to what would be target. Okay. I want to share one final rubric with you, and this is an internship score guide. And as you can see here, we also have a three-column rubric. And I've highlighted this one element on differentiating instruction, okay? Plans for differences in individual needs, abilities. And what I consider important here is that this darkened area of this particular rubric really highlights the aspect of the performance that's very explicit in terms of what the expectation is. So the area for competency is planning for differences. And the first part of the rubric says they do not plan or minimally plan. And then it goes on to say, because it would be hard, I think, for a candidate to say, wait a minute, what do you mean I didn't plan or I minimally planned? What does it mean to plan more than that? So it's explicit. It says instruction is not individualized. A one-size-fits-all approach is taken. The teacher candidate uses one instructional model and approach throughout the lesson. So there's a lot in here that's very explicit about what would qualify as not meeting a standard of performance. In the next one, it does say that most of the planning is including instructional adaptations. And it says that in terms of performance, it is observable that the candidate is using multiple instructional approaches throughout the lesson to account for variations in learning styles. And then finally, in the final part of the rubric, it talks about using multiple instructional approaches throughout the lesson, and students are given multiple choices. So it takes it one step further and said aside from using a few differentiated approaches during the lesson itself, students are given choices within practice tasks that they can choose based on their own individual differences. Okay, so it goes one step further. So now I'm going to turn back to the chat and open it up here and see that we've got a couple of questions, which is great. So how would rubrics for key assessments in SPA reports for individual programs be integrated into CAPE assessment rubrics? Ha, very good question. And here's what. Stevie Checko has said that for the CAPE self-study report, they are looking for unit-wide assessments. So those individual rubrics, okay, for your SPA reports would not necessarily be included. But if you have a rubric, let's say or a scoring guide for student teaching or clinical residency, and a number, everybody's using some kind of an observational tool there, one of the things you might consider, and this is something that I believe the SPAs allow, is for common elements in that rubric that across all programs there are certain expectations, whether you teach science, you know, at the high school level or teach elementary education, that there are certain keys to candidate performance that would be an expectation regardless of content area. And so those might be the elements that you would include and look to for the CAPE rubric and that they would assess, and that you would be explicit in saying, and these last 3 to 4 items or whatever are very specific to the content area. And I know that a number of programs have done that. I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope it does. And please speak up or send me another text if it does not. It says in the rubric, another question says, in the rubric from the University of New Hampshire, category 3.4, unacceptable, do we need to worry about the wording significantly? No, and I'm going to ask a question back, or answer this question in two parts. I'm wondering if you're talking about the wording of the categories, progression levels in your rubric. And in that, you don't need to worry about it, just something for you to consider. You know, the old NCATE rubrics that went with the standards had a certain wording, but I'm seeing a lot of EPPs now working on wording that's like emerging, developing, progressing, proficient, you know, that kind of wording for their headings. And so I think that's an EPP choice, and certainly something that you would want to have be defensible, okay? If you are talking about the wording within the rubric, so for example, let's go to 3.4. This is the CAPE one, so let me close this down and go back to the University of New Hampshire. I mean University of New Haven, there you go, 3.4. If you're talking here about the wording of what's contained inside here, you need to worry about it to the extent that it's explicit in differentiating candidate performance at each one of your rubric levels, okay? And that the wording is explicit enough and observable enough and has shared meaning. So, you know, as you describe how your instrument was developed, you would want to talk about, to a certain extent, that this was, you know, shared with faculty, or that there was a committee assigned to look at it, and then that was widely shared, including with your stakeholders, and that everyone agreed that this was as close as you could get for the time being on what it is you were looking for in candidate performance. You also might want to check, cross-check it with other instruments, which provides a certain amount of validity in the development. Other instruments that are publicly out there, whether it's a Danielson framework or something else that you use as an anchor or a benchmark for your own rubrics. Another way might be to go to the INTAS standards and look at their beginning teacher progression level. Like, this is where we expect all beginning teachers to come into the profession at. And you can use that to a certain extent to say, oh, you know, this is what we used as a way to develop some of the wording that's contained in our own rubric. So I hope that is helpful. And if I answered your question, you'll let me know. Can a rubric, another question, can the rubric be devoid of category wording of progression levels? Devoid of wording about progression levels, meaning can you just go level 1, level 2, level 3? Kind of like the CAPE assessment rubric did? Yes, you certainly could do that, but it would need to be explicit somehow in saying, like the CAPE assessment rubric does, it says level 1, level 2, level 3. You know, level 1 does not meet minimum criteria. And there needs to be some kind of a key there to help understand whether 1's the highest and 3's the lowest, or 3's the highest, 1's the lowest, and some way to help you be able to interpret your results. So you need to have some kind of an understanding about what those would mean. Okay? So let's see, was there anything else? Can the rubric? Yes, okay. And there was another question about, there is a debate about choice of wording. And one member suggested doing without. Well, like I said, you can do without. Just be clear on what you mean by each of your levels, because your participants or your scorers are going to definitely want to know. Okay, I'm going to go see if we have any hands up, because we're almost out of time here. It is 6:00 p.m. and we are out of time. Let's see, I don't see any other hands up. I appreciate that. All righty. So let me scroll over to the side here and let me get back to my PowerPoint. and see where we are. I think it was to the point about getting questions from you, and yes, in fact, I was. I'm going to stay on the line here for as long as it takes in case anyone has questions and they don't want to raise them publicly. And I'm going to share our next steps. I did record this webinar, and I will keep recording until all questions are answered. It will be available by early next week. Generally, the tech team is very good about getting this up in the next day or two afterwards. You can find it under Take Resources again. Don't go to the sidebars, just click on Resources and you'll find them. Our next webinar is on May 13th. It's at 1 in the afternoon, and it's going to focus on surveys and survey construction and evaluation. And just a reminder, each week Kate sends out an announcement 1 week in advance about the webinar, the topic, and the link to the webinar. We're going to add now a note about what materials would be useful to have on hand to prepare for the webinar. And that was, too, was a suggestion that we got from a survey that I send out after each webinar for feedback. And so I appreciate whatever feedback you can give us. And you should, within a couple of days, receive an email from me that includes the link to a SurveyMonkey survey about this webinar. And it will ask some short questions. I don't think there's any more than 5 questions about the ease of getting on the webinar, any tech problems, and then your feedback on the content and any recommendations you have for either future topics or for improving the webinar itself. And so I look forward to your feedback. Let me close this up and close this up and go back to this right here and ask anybody who has a question right now. Here I am. I'm here for you, absolutely willing to stay online until all questions are answered. Let me scroll down in our chat box here and see if there are any more that I haven't gotten to yet. Would you show the page again with the quality questions to use when checking our work? Sure, I will. Okay, let's go to that. My little mousey here does not seem to want to do its thing. There we go. And one more. And there we are. Okay, here are the quality check questions. Again, this will be shared with you. How appropriate is it? Is it aligned with the standards? Is it definable? Do you have an agreed upon meaning? And what has even been suggested sometimes to the person, let me see, who asked me that question, Sherry, is that maybe you can put like a little asterisk next to a word where there may be some disagreement and define it, or at the end include a little glossary where some terms are defined that might be helpful. Probably a better method would be to share with your stakeholders and see if there's language that you might be using at your EPP that means something different to your stakeholders, to your personnel, or vice versa, and how to maybe, put something parenthetically to give it more definition so that it's mutually understood, in addition to training sessions and the other things that we do. Definability, observability, distinct from one another, so that as we looked at those, at a number of rubrics that I shared with you, that they can really provide specific and meaningful feedback to the candidate. Because, when final analysis, what we're really looking for here is, and I may be talking out of school, but what we're really looking for here is not so much the satisfaction of Kate with our rubrics and our scoring guides, although I know that's a concern because you do want to be accredited, or must be accredited, and the states would require it. I know that's a concern, but what I'm saying is in the final analysis, what we want to be doing is preparing teachers who are really ready for the classroom, as ready as they can be without having years of teaching experience under their belts, as ready as they can be for a classroom. And so we want our rubrics and our scoring guides ultimately to be able to provide the kind of specificity and feedback and the context for feedback to candidates, where if we know that candidates are getting similar feedback. One of the things that I've experienced, both as a faculty member and then later as an administrator of an EPP, a School of Education, was that, you know, candidates talk, and they all do this, and they share, well, you know, who's your supervisor? Oh, you know, you got so-and-so, that's great, she's really great, or he's really great, blah, blah, blah. And then another one, oh, boy, you know, watch out for that one because they're really nitpicky. Well, what we want to have available in our scoring guides and our rubric is sort of a common understanding that this is really what we expect from our candidates. And I know that Professor Y's particular interest is in, let's say, I don't know, questioning, which is a great thing to have as a specific interest, but nonetheless. And so tends to put more emphasis on that in terms of candidate feedback, whereas another supervisor might be putting more emphasis on a different aspect. It might be on, you know, acknowledging students' contributions or providing explicit feedback or whatever. And what we want is for our candidates to be able to get the benefits of what is known to be effective performance, and that it's in the rubric in such a way that a candidate can have that feedback no matter who the supervisor might be. Even though there are individual differences in people's different styles and things like that, and that's a good thing. We're not trying to, I don't think rubrics and scoring guides are trying to wipe those out, but it does provide a context that we know that our candidate, there's a fairness in those rubrics and scoring guides, okay? So distinct from one another so that it provides that specific and meaningful feedback, that's sort of universal feedback that we would give to any candidate. And let's say, oh, and then the completeness, and then of course this freedom from bias, which is the validity and reliability stuff. And in the future, we will have time to have an entire webinar on reliability and validity, okay? And it says how much evidence is expected for inter-rater reliability efforts. Good question, and what I'm going to do in order to answer that is to go back to this final rubric because it did have some information on that. So here we go on training the scorers in terms of inter-rater reliability. All right, you're going to want to have multiple raters that are trained, okay, and that you're looking at those trainings over time. I had actually did a very brief survey of some criteria for inter-rater reliability that was available online. And not only is it about having multiple scores and having training sessions for those scores, but have you had multiple trainings? Okay, that was kind of one of the benchmark standards for inter-rater reliability, is that there wasn't just, well, let's get everybody together in a room and we all look at the same performance of the same product and we score it independently, and then we talk about our differences and we come to agreement. But then that's not the last point at which people are brought together, the sort of one-shot deal, the inoculation, the one-day professional development opportunity, that there are other opportunities as well, whether that happens online or face-to-face. You know, a follow-up could be that everybody then gets a particular piece of student work or a video, and you do it again and see if the scores reliability is better or worse as a result of your training, and then using that as a decider about whether or not to have another one. Another important aspect of the training of scores is their understanding of their own personal bias that influences their scoring of candidates. And I think that's illustrated by the story I just told about, you know, professors who have particular areas of interest. And so those tend to get more emphasis or less emphasis in student teaching or candidate observations of performance. And so one of the things is to have one of the training sessions just be about one's own personal or professional or even societal expectations that are such that they interfere with our ability to provide an objective evaluation of the candidate's performance. And that too is where our scoring rubrics come into play. Okay, so let me get off of this one and go back to my PowerPoint. Here we go, and see if we have any other questions. Okay, so I hope that answered the inter-rater reliability efforts. And CAPE's expectation is simply that they will be trained and that there are multiple raters. That's the baseline for CAPE. Okay, let me see. We've still got a few people online. Let me view all participants, see if anybody's hand is raised. Kathleen, I see your hand raised. Did you have a question, or is that from the last time?
It was from before, but I just wanted to say thank you. This has really been good.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. And I wish I'd had a better answer to Greg's question.
We'll look forward to that answer.
The 7,000 standards we now need to meet as EPPs and how to cram it all into one rubric. So
that's really where we're struggling as well.
Yeah, I know. I heard that. I hear that quite a bit. All
right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. Anybody else? Last call here. We're at almost 6:15. And I'm going to scroll down to my chat and see, yes, thanks, bye, thanks. You're very welcome. It is my pleasure, and you can all expect a Survey Monkey from me sometime in the next couple of days. I hope you'll take the time to respond for me, because I appreciate all your feedback. All right, folks, I'm going to stop recording, and I'm going to shut down the